One of the most appealing things about Naruto as a show is the vast amount of ways that somebody can acquire strength. Genuinely, I believe Naruto has some of the greatest variety and powers out of any anime in existence. There's obviously the 5 nature releases that can affect your ninjutsu. There's genjutsu, there's taijutsu. But within ninjutsu and genjutsu and taijutsu, there's even smaller subcategories that are just as interesting. And then there's things like dojutsus, yin-yang release, jinchurikis. However, there seems to be one way to attain power that most people are obsessed with, and that's probably because the main character of the show used this method to obtain most of his power. That being said, Naruto trained in pretty much all things important except for dojutsu, so what am I talking about? Well, today we're talking about Sage Mode. And while I've explained what Sage Mode is prior in a general sense a long time ago, today I want to talk about all types of Sage Modes and how they apply to each other. More specifically, I want to talk about each individual Sage Mode and which is the strongest amongst all of them. However, this might be a little tough though, considering the fact that no Sage Mode is explicitly said to be stronger than the other. So this is largely going to be built on conjecture. Hope that's cool with you. But before we get to conjecting anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And while we're talking about jumping to conclusions, I'm gonna jump to the conclusion that if you like my face and when I talk about Naruto, you're gonna love my other page, The Weeb Commander, where my face is, but also I talk about other animes that aren't Naruto. On The Weeb Commander, I talk all shonen anime, One Punch Man, Hunter x Hunter, One Piece, Black Clover, Attack on Titan, Demon Slayer, MHA. I also have 2 other YouTube pages, NC Gamer 23, where instead of talking anime at all, I just play video games, or Hammer's Collection, where instead of talking anime while sitting in this chair, I talk it while I unbox massive statues, like this bad boy behind me. Yes, by the way, that does say it weighs 43 kilograms. That's 95 pounds. That's how heavy the statue is. Well, actually, the statue itself is only 34 kilograms, which is still like 70 pounds. So Sage Mode. It's one of the most interesting power systems in Naruto because it's one of its most complex power systems. And Sage Mode comes in a couple different packages, but at their core, all Sage Modes work the same way, which we should go over before we talk about individual Sage Modes. So Sage Mode, at its most bare bones, is the mixing of one's own chakra with nature chakra to create Senjutsu chakra. But what is nature chakra? How do you mix it with your own chakra? What are the chakra ratios? And how does Senjutsu chakra power you up? Well, nature chakra is a bit of an abstract concept. Referred to as natural energy, nature chakra is basically just the chakra of everything on Earth. The earth, the ground, the trees in the water all have innate energy. And this natural energy has always existed on Earth. There's a common misconception that Hashirama was the person who spread nature energy all across Earth, because he was the person who spread chakra to every single human being. Well, he actually didn't spread chakra to them. That's more complicated. We'll cover it in a little bit. But regardless, Hashirama was not responsible for the creation of natural energy on Earth. Nature energy, while abundant though, is imperceptible to all people who aren't sages. Therefore, when one is training in Sage Mode, they need to become perfectly still and become one with nature in order to perceive this imperceptible energy. And once one begins to be able to perceive natural energy, that's when they can pull it into their body and mix it with their own chakra. However, just pulling in nature energy isn't enough to become a sage. In order to activate a Sage Mode transformation, even an imperfect one, you have to perfectly balance how much nature chakra you're pulling into your body and how much you're blending it with your own chakra. If somebody is pulling in nature chakra and pulls in too little nature chakra, they won't be able to make enough Senjutsu chakra to power up into a Sage Mode. And if somebody pulls in too much nature chakra and blends it with their chakra at too high of a level, they create too much Senjutsu chakra, which turns humans into animals and then stone. Now, this is another misconception because people believe that only those trained in Mount Muabuku have the ability to turn into stone if they absorb too much natural energy. However, that misconception was created because we've only ever really seen people train in Mount Muabuku. We've never really seen anybody train in Ryuchi Cave. Regardless of where you train or who you train under, if you pull in too much nature chakra and therefore make too much Senjutsu chakra, you will petrify. It's just the difference of whether or not you'll turn into a snake or a toad first. However, if you accidentally do pull in too much nature chakra, there is ways to reverse this. Reverse the transformation, then petrification, that is. From what we've seen, there's 2 ways to expel nature energy from somebody's body before they petrify. One is releasing all of the nature energy from your body. Well, they're both kind of releasing all the nature energy from your body, but I'll explain. The first situation I'm talking about is the technique called Fury. You see, I've done a whole video on the forbidden technique Fury that you can watch right here, but basically, Fury is a technique where somebody is marked with a seal, and that seal, once activated, pulls in a massive amount of nature energy. And once enough nature energy has been pulled in, time, that person initiates an explosion of nature energy. And this explosion of nature energy is large enough to wipe things like Konoha off the map. Now, normally, if somebody absorbed this much nature energy, they would turn into a snake or a toad and then turn into a stone. However, because that nature energy is being expelled faster than that person can transform, they're fine. Everyone around them, though, not so much. The only other way we ever see nature energy expelled from the body is out Mount Muabuko. It's out Mount Muabuko that Fukusaku, aka Pa, wields a rod that if it comes into contact with somebody, expels all the nature energy from their body. So essentially, if Pa sees you pulling in too much natural energy, he'll hit you with this staff and all the nature energy in your body will expel. It's an incredibly useful and plot convenient tool. But there's also people who can pull in nature energy all the time and don't have to worry about transforming. Well, at least they don't have to worry about transforming into a toad, a snake, or a rock. Jugo, one of the members of Kara, has a clan-specific Kekkei Genkai that allows him to naturally pull in nature energy at all times. And because Jugo is always pulling in nature energy, one, he basically never runs out of chakra, but two, if he does pull in too much nature energy, his body undergoes transformations. Now, usually he can control these transformations to make rocket arms or rocket legs or big old spiky fists. But should Jugo pull in too much nature chakra and therefore have too much senjutsu chakra in his whole body undergoes a demonic transformation. And Jugo loses control of this demonic transformation and basically tries to kill everything around him. And using this ability, Orochimaru with a vial of Jugo's blood was able to give this ability to other people in the form of a cursed seal. That is to say, once a cursed seal is activated, it pulls in nature energy from around that person and powers them up, which is why people with cursed seals, once they enter their stage 2 transformation, look a lot like Jugo's transformation when he pulls in too much senjutsu chakra. That is to say that essentially users of the cursed seal are sage mode users. But just being able to blend natural energy with your own chakra isn't actually enough to activate sage mode. Outside of making the golden ratio of nature chakra and regular chakra to create senjutsu chakra in the correct amount in your body also has to be strong enough to hold a sage mode transformation. That is to say, if your body's not physically strong enough, it doesn't matter if you can create senjutsu in the perfect amount, your body won't be able to transform to a perfect sage mode or even an imperfect sage mode. We know this because Orochimaru, once he discovered Ryuchi Cave, was able to create senjutsu chakra, but wasn't able to undergo the sage mode transformation because his body was too weak. So how do you acquire different sage modes and how do they stack up against each other? Well, we'll talk about sage modes from weakest to strongest, and while we're talking about them in their respective power slots, we'll talk about how you acquire them and what these transformations do for you. So we've already touched on our first kind of sage mode in this video already. That's because the first kind of sage mode we're going to be talking about and the weakest kind of sage mode we're going to be talking about is cursed seals. Yes, I consider those with cursed seals sage users. Now, there's two different kinds of cursed seals, the cursed seal of heaven and the cursed seal of earth. However, by and large, we only ever really see the cursed seal of heaven because Kimimaro was the only person to ever get the earth version. And for the purposes of this video, they work exactly the same. But how does the cursed seal of heaven work? What abilities does it give you and how is it activated? Well, the cursed seal has to be placed on you by Orochimaru because he's the person who created them. And in order to place a cursed seal, Orochimaru has to bite a target. But at least for a long time, that's largely what we believed. But Mitsuki does have a curse mark on his liver, and I don't know how Orochimaru would have bitten his liver, or it might be on his heart. I honestly can't remember. I just know Mitsuki has a cursed seal in his body. So maybe he's found other ways to impart this cursed seal onto people, but we're not entirely sure how he does it, outside of the biting, of course. Now, cursed seal works kind of weird. Essentially, it is what I stated it was earlier. It's a way to tap into nature energy around you by unleashing the seal. And by unleashing the seal, you start to see a pattern creep across the body of the user. And the more of the seal that's being unleashed, and therefore the more power of the seal that's being used, the further this pattern goes across the body. This is called a level 1 transformation. And in a level 1 transformation, the user has increased chakra and physical abilities. Like with most sage modes, but a little bit worse. However, the true strength of a cursed seal lies in the second transformation. Once the markings have made it all the way across a person's body, they'll transform to their second form. And what's truly telling about this being a sage technique, to me at least, is in the second form transformation, most cursed seal users take on animal-like appearances. Sasuke grows wings, that spider mouth guy became a spider, which shows me that this is very similar to an imperfect sage transformation, but like a very, very imperfect sage mode transformation, because Jiraiya was an imperfect sage and all he got was a weird nose and a couple of warts, while these people are growing spider legs or wings, which are useful in combat, albeit, but in the scope of a sage mode transformation, the more you look like the animal that you're modeling after, the less perfect the sage mode transformation is. Now, in this second level of transformation, the users have more chakra and better physical abilities, but cursed seals can also bring different things to different people. See, obviously to the Sound Village 4 and Sasuke, it brought power and chakra chakra, but to people like the Iburi clan who had a Genkai that allowed them to turn their bodies into smoke, which sounds cool until you accidentally turn into smoke and there's a stiff breeze and it blows away all the smoke, essentially killing you. And they can't really control when they turn into smoke, so they had to live in a cave because that's the only place there wasn't wind. When a curse seal was placed on them, it gave them better control of their Genkai, allowing them to turn into smoke when they wanted to and not be smoke when they wanted to. That's basically where the good things about the curse seal run out. See, because remember, these curse seals were based off Jugo's blood. And if you'll take a second to remember what happens to Jugo whenever he takes in too much Senjutsu chakra, he becomes a giant demon that wants to kill everything near him. So it makes sense that if people actually hold their level 2 transformations for too long, their minds corrode to a point of essentially breaking, making them insane homicidal monsters who are trying to kill anything near them. But even if you're not using your level 2 transformation for longer than you're supposed to, any use of the curse seal corrodes your mind, because use of the curse seal takes your chakra and replaces it with Orochimaru's Senjutsu chakra. That is to say, you are essentially replacing your own chakra with Orochimaru's. And by use of this curse seal, it eventually corrodes your brain and makes you more susceptible to the commands of Orochimaru. That is to say, the longer you use your curse seal, the more likely you are to listen to the whims of a homicidal maniac. That's a pretty big downside, but it does have a relatively good payoff in terms of power. But because of that huge downside, it's got to be the weakest on the list. Now, obviously, individuals will be able to use these different kinds of sage modes at higher proficiencies than others. That is to say that just because Naruto might be stronger than Mitsuki, that doesn't necessarily mean that being a toad sage is stronger than being a snake sage. To understand which sage mode might be the strongest, we have to look at things like the abilities given by different sage modes and how they boost your own abilities. Therefore, we have to look objectively at the sage mode, not the user of the sage mode. Why am I saying all of this? Well, because the next entry on the list is toad sage mode. Yes, the sage mode used by Naruto, Minato, Jiraiya, even Hashirama, I'm saying is the weakest of all the major ones. But why am I saying this? It's kind of a stretch, right? Well, toad sage mode is probably the easiest of all of the sage modes on this list to learn. I mean, we know of 5 toad sage users: Jiraiya, Kashin Koji, Hashirama, Naruto, and Minato, 4 of which were able to master it perfectly. While things like Tail Beast Sage mode, or Snake Sage mode, or Sage of Six Paths mode, we only know 1, maybe 2 perfect sages ever. Now, you could say that this is because learning from the toads is a lot more accessible and less dangerous than learning from the snakes, or you have to be a Sage of Six Paths to learn Sage of Six Paths mode, but I genuinely believe that it's just simply easier to master Toad Sage mode than any of the other Sage modes. But ease of learning doesn't really factor into what we're talking about today, because today we're talking about power. But to talk about power, we have to talk about how one acquires Toad Sage mode. Essentially, in order to acquire Toad Sage mode, you need to find your way to Mount Muabuko, which isn't necessarily easy because Mount Muabuko does exist in a different dimensional plane than the rest of Earth. And the only reason that Jiraiya was able to find it is because he reverse summoned himself there while trying to get a summoning animal. However, once you arrive to Mount Muabuko, the process becomes a lot easier. You see, once you arrive at Mount Muabuko, you're taught by the toads to stay entirely still to pull in nature energy. And this is done by placing a flat plate upon a tall spike for somebody to sit upon. Now, obviously, with a flat surface on top of a spike, if you move even a little bit, you're gonna fall. Therefore, somebody has to remain perfectly still in order to stay upon the spike. And once you're able to sit completely still, you become one with nature. However, at Mount Muabuko, they also have a pseudo cheat code. You see, the toads at Mount Muabuko have an oil that you can place on your skin. And this oil, once placed on your skin, naturally pulls in nature energy without you doing any work. That is to say, it operates exactly the same as Jugo's clan's Genkai. However, this oil only works at Mount Muabuko because Mount Muabuko has a unique atmosphere. Once this oil leaves that unique atmosphere, it evaporates. So now that somebody is in tune with the nature chakra around them and able to create senjutsu in their own body, what abilities are given with Toad Sage mode? Well, we've seen a lot of them because we've seen so many users of Toad Sage mode. There's things like Fighting Tongue Bind or Fighting Tongue Slash, which essentially allows Shima, aka Ma, to grow her tongue to its maximum size. She then, with the scent of her enemy, can have that tongue hunt down an enemy and either bind them or slash them. There's also things like Sage Art Amphibian Technique. Now, Sage Art Amphibian Technique is one of the strongest abilities that Toad Sage mode gives you. However, it's very tough to pull off and you need 3 people to do it. Essentially, the way that Amphibian Technique works is that it's very specific to Jiraiya. See, Jiraiya isn't good at pulling in nature energy. That's why he can't become a perfect sage. Essentially, Jiraiya isn't good at the mixing of the chakra and therefore kind of always overdoes it. In order to circumvent the need to pull in nature chakra himself, he binds Ma and Pa to his shoulders. And Ma and Pa, who are both about 800 years and have been Toad Sages their entire lives, pull in the nature chakra for Jiraiya and then pump it into his body. This allows Jiraiya, basically Jugo's ability, to be pulling in nature energy while he's fighting. But like I said, this ability is pretty specific to Jiraiya and also needs 3 people. But since we're talking about 3 people jutsus, there's also another very good 3-person jutsu that comes with Jiraiya and Ma and Pa. Ma. This jutsu is Demonic Illusion Toad Confrontation Chant. This jutsu requires Ma and Pa to sing a song, and anybody upon hearing the song is locked into a genjutsu until Ma and Pa release them. The only problem with this genjutsu is that it takes a long time to start, basically alerting all the enemies around you to leave the area. And therefore, if you want this genjutsu to work, you need an ally there to keep the enemy occupied. And also, it requires 2 great Toad sages to harmonize together to pull off. And also, once they're done singing it, their throats are kind of hosed for the rest of the day and they need rest, meaning that you get to do this jutsu once a day at max. So the massive amount of setup that one needs, and also the fact that once again you need 3 people to pull this off, makes it not a super powerful jutsu. The true strength of Toad Sage mode comes in Frog Kata. See, Sage mode increases the user's abilities, strength, reflexes, all of that. And because of that, Taijutsu is heavily used when somebody has activated Sage mode. However, even with increased speed and strength, sometimes you can just dodge Taijutsu. And this is where Frog Kata comes in. You see, Frog Kata envelops somebody in Senjutsu aura. And this Senjutsu aura can act as an extension of their blows. So let's say I throw a right punch at you, but you dodge it, I can extend my aura to hit you. And these punches, being boosted with the power of Senjutsu, are enough to cripple people in one hit. And since Senjutsu aura is just like nature energy and is imperceptible to those who aren't trained in Sage mode, unless you have a Rinnegan or are trained in Sage mode, you cannot see these punches coming. However, since Frog Kata is the strongest thing that Toad Sage users get, and it's basically just buff Taijutsu, that's why I have them at second lowest from the list. Now, obviously Naruto is able to add Senjutsu to things like Tail Beast Bombs and Rasen Shurikens, but those things are specific to Naruto, and are also largely tied into his Tailed Beast Sage mode. So for those reasons, yes, I know it feels disrespectful, Toad Sage mode is second from the bottom. And just above Toad Sage mode is our next entry on the list, Snake Sage mode. Now, we've only ever seen one perfect Snake Sage, and that's Mitsuki. However, I don't love calling Mitsuki a perfect Snake Sage, because while it is technically canon that he is a perfect Snake Sage, a lot of things point in the direction of him not being that. The reason I believe Mitsuki was created is so that Orochimaru could understand what perfect Snake Sage mode would look like. This is why he ran all those experiments with Log in order to make Mitsuki activate Snake Sage mode. Also because Orochimaru himself was never able to activate Snake Sage mode even though he could create Senjutsu Chakra perfectly, because his body was too weak. However, Mitsuki is a clone of Orochimaru, and therefore when he activates Snake Sage mode, his body has a difficult time maintaining it, which is why, once again, I hesitate to call him a perfect Snake Sage. The third reason I hesitate to call him a perfect Snake Sage is because, as far as we know, Sage mode transformations in terms of perfectness rely a lot on appearance. Essentially, the less your appearance changes, the more perfected your Sage mode is. However, when Mitsuki enters his Snake Sage mode, he grows a horn, which to me at least is eerily reminiscent of Jiraiya growing things like a goatee and warts. But ignoring Mitsuki for a second, the only other 2 people we've ever seen even try to become Snake Sages were Orochimaru and Kabuto. And Orochimaru wasn't able to transform into a sage, and Kabuto had a hilariously imperfect transformation. However, Kabuto never went through the process of turning into a Snake Sage the correct way. He simply turned into a Snake Sage because Orochimaru's cells took over his body. But the same could be said for Mitsuki. He also didn't technically go through the right process to become a Snake Sage. So how does one technically go through the correct process to become a Snake Sage? Well, it's not fun. It's definitely worse than sitting on a spike, that's for sure. In order to become a Snake Sage, you have to find Ryuchi Cave, and then you have to enter Ryuchi Cave. And once you've made it past all of the very creepy and crawly snakes, you have to find the Great White Snake Sage. And once you find the Great White Snake Sage, who is a massive, probably 100-foot long snake, you have to let that snake bite you. And once the Great White Snake Sage bites you, it will inject nature energy into your body, a bit like Orochimaru's cursed seals. And if your body's strong enough to accept the power of Snake Sage mode, it will transform without hesitation. However, if your body's not strong enough to undergo the transformation, the Great White Snake Sage just eats you. And considering the fact that Orochimaru is technically the only person we've ever seen bitten by the Great White Snake Sage, probably means that the majority of people who stumble upon Ryuchi Cave end up getting eaten. As to why Orochimaru, who couldn't undergo the transformation into Snake Sage mode, wasn't eaten by the Great White Snake Sage, I don't know. In fact, nobody knows. Even though we've only ever seen one perfect Snake Sage mode user, doesn't mean those who we've seen fight with it haven't been incredibly powerful. Obviously, our only 2 point of references here are Kabuto and Mitsuki, but we know a couple of abilities given to both Kabuto and Mitsuki through Snake Sage mode. And those abilities are incredibly strong, much stronger than what was given with Toad Sage mode. Since we've already talked about Mitsuki, let's first talk about Kabuto. From Kabuto, we saw a couple of Sage Art techniques. The first of which was Sage Art White Rage technique. Now, Kabuto Kabuto goes so far as to say that this is a technique taught to those who studied in Ryuchi Cave. Oh wait, yeah, because he actually did go to Ryuchi Cave. But also having Orochimaru's cells is what allowed him to pull in Senjutsu Chakra so perfectly. Regardless, after the Snake Sage Mode user does the proper hand seals, they release a dragon from their mouths. And this dragon carries an orb in its left hand. And once the dragon coils itself around this orb, the orb explodes with a massive amount of light and pressure. Essentially imagine the worst flashbang in the history of flashbangs. The light immediately blinds any enemies of the Sage Mode user, and the pressure release oscillates the air around the enemies, which creates paralyzing pain for them. Meanwhile, the Sage Mode user is unaffected by this because Sage Mode users can do some wild stuff to their bodies. Kabuto, because of his snake-like characteristics, which was brought on by his transformation, is able to liquefy his organs to undo the effects of the oscillating waves of air. He also has a separate set of eyelids that he can use to block his cornea to stop the blinding light. On top of this, everybody who's ever trained in Ryuchi Cave has the ability to use Sage Art in organic reincarnation. And this ability is miles better than anything you get with Toad Sage Mode. See, essentially, those who trained in Ryuchi Cave are able to breathe life into inorganic material by filling the atmosphere with natural energy. That is to say that a snake sage can breathe life into dirt or rocks and enslave them to their cause, creating massive golems that can fight your enemies, or simply just opening up massive holes in the ground for your enemies to fall into. It's element bending, essentially, except the elements you create are sentient. On top of that, we've seen with Snake Sage Mode, just like with Toad Sage Mode, you're able to enhance your already existing abilities with Senjutsu Chakra. Just like how Mitsuki's able to use his Senjutsu Chakra to buff up his Snake Lightning, creating Sage Art Great Snake Lightning. So the fact that Snake Sage Mode and Toad Sage Mode both give you physical and chakra boosts, but Snake Sage Mode allows you to breathe life into lifeless things and control them, puts it above Toad Sage Mode for me. Now obviously there's two Sage Modes that exist at the top here, Tail Beast Sage Mode and Sage's Sixth Path Mode. But there's one more Sage Mode before we get to either of those two, and that Sage Mode is Hashirama's Sage Mode. You see, we don't necessarily know what Hashirama's Sage Mode was. We just know that it gave him and then Madara an insane amount of power. But what kind of power are we talking about? What kind of power was given to Hashirama and Madara that made it so much better than Toad Sage Mode or Snake Sage Mode? Well, here's the thing. Like I said earlier, we don't know what kind of sage Hashirama was. We just know he was a sage. But we do know that he could enter his Sage Mode in seconds. And we do know that Hashirama was able to substantiate the Sage Mode for a very long time, having stated being able to fight Madara for a day straight. Now here's the thing, most people to substantiate a Sage Mode have to use things like shadow clones or having Mom Pa fused to their shoulders. Kabuto was able to keep his Sage Mode active forever because he stole some of Jugo's DNA, so he's always naturally pulling in nature energy. We've never seen Hashirama do any of these things. We never saw Hashirama have shadow clones. He obviously wasn't from Jugo's clan. As far as we understand it, Hashirama was able to activate his Sage Mode in seconds and then just keep it. Now, was this just because Hashirama was so naturally talented at everything he did, or was his specific brand of Sage Mode just naturally very powerful? Unfortunately, we can't really tell, because the only two people we've ever seen use Hashirama Sage Mode were Hashirama and Madara, who was able to tap into it because he had Hashirama's cells. Madara, after tapping into Hashirama's cells and activating Sage Mode, remarked about how easy it was to tap into Sage Mode. And once again, that leaves us with the question mark of, was it Hashirama Sage Mode, which was easy to master, or was it just Madara being a genius? Regardless, what we do know is that Hashirama and Madara used this Sage Mode to great effect. Essentially, Hashirama would ride around on his massive wood constructs, be them golems or just massive roots, and stand still while pulling in nature chakra. And in this way, Hashirama was able to fight while maintaining Sage Mode. But that also meant while he was pulling in nature energy, he could still be weaving chakra for ninjutsu. And the ninjutsu that Hashirama could pull off while in Sage Mode were insane. Hashirama has an ability while he is in Sage Mode called Sage Art Gate of the Great God. Now this jutsu allows Hashirama to manifest a large number of red tori. Tori are those very iconic Japanese red gates. They usually lead up to temples. And these tori fall down on enemies. And these tori can range in size to small enough to bind a human to big enough to bind the 10 tails. Yes, that's right, a non-full powered Hashirama, mind you, was able to use this technique to bind the thing that terraformed the earth. Because not only does the Tori make you not able to move a finger, it also suppresses your will to oppose the person who used these gates on you. Essentially, it's like Xanax in the form of a gate. It chills you out. On top of this, just like with Toad and Snake Sage modes, the Sage user is able to increase the power of their existing ninjutsu. However, in Hashirama's case, it is exponentially increased. You see, Hashirama, while not in Sage mode, is able to use his wood release at an incredibly high level. However, after he's activated Sage mode, he's able to do things like true Thousand Arms Kanon, which is the manifestation of essentially a Buddhist god with 1,000 hands that was able to punch a Susanoo off of Kurama. And the fact that this is basically the only power-up that Hashirama had outside of being Ashura's reincarnation and allowed him to stand toe-to-toe with Madara for Madara's entire life implies to me that this Sage mode gives a much larger boost than either Frog or Snake. Like, I'm aware that Hashirama was strong his whole life, okay? But Madara was a dual EMS wielder who captured Kurama. Hashirama really, genuinely only had this Sage transformation. But now that we've gotten those two old coots out of the way, let's get to the true strongest Sage modes that there is. The second strongest mode on this list is Tailed Beast Sage mode. Now, we know for a fact that we've seen Naruto use this technique, but we're not entirely sure if we saw Minato use this technique. You see, essentially Naruto, after gaining the cooperation of Kurama, is able to combine his Jin Cloak mode with his Sage mode. And because he's able to use both of these forms simultaneously, he gets both forms' advantages simultaneously, which means he gets things like Frog Kata and an infinite flow of chakra from Shadow Clones, on top of the fact that he also gets the massive boost in speed, power, and chakra and ninjutsu output that the Jin Cloak gives him. However, we can't necessarily say that this technique is specific to Minato or Naruto. We just know that a Jinchuriki with a collaboration of their tailed beast might be able to pull in more nature chakra than they were able to do without the collaboration of their tailed beast. Because Naruto, now that he's collaborating with Kurama, can have Kurama pull in nature chakra for him. And since Kurama is always technically sitting still in the middle of Naruto, he's always able to pull in nature energy, which essentially allows Naruto to enter this mode whenever he wants. And as long as Kurama is focused on pulling in nature energy, he can basically do it infinitely. And this mode allowed Naruto to go toe-to-toe with Obito while he was the 10-tailed Jinchuriki, and with Toneri Otsutsuki. In fact, Naruto's become so proficient with the technique, he can now A, fly with it, and B, shatter Truth Seeker balls. Since Truth Seeker balls are a Kekemora and are made using the 5 basic chakra releases and yin and yang, their only weakness is Senjutsu chakra. Naruto is able to use so much Senjutsu chakra in his output that he can destroy these Kekemora like he did against Toneri. So while obviously a lot of the power of this mode is derived from Naruto himself, the fact that this mode gives Naruto the ability to fly and destroy Kekemora puts it above all the other ones. Because prior to the figuring out of this mode, he couldn't do either of those things. And you might be thinking,
Well, they're just a True Seeker orb. They've been destroyed before.
Kekemora, like the True Seeker orbs in the Sword of Nunabuko, were quite literally used to create the world, and Obito himself said they could be used to destroy the world. Therefore, the ability to shatter those and therefore permanently get rid of them is an insanely powerful ability. However, it's not as strong as the last Sage mode on this list, Sage of Six Paths mode. You see, in order to acquire the Sage of Six Paths mode, you don't have to get bit by a snake or train with a toad. You just need to have it gifted to you by Hagoromo. And Hagoromo gifts it to those who we believe have an iron faith in humanity. The first person we ever saw use it was obviously Hagoromo, but then he also gifted this mode to Ashura, his son. And then much later in the timeline, it was gifted to Naruto. Well, a lot of the true strength of Sage of Six Path mode just comes in making Sage mode a lot stronger, in that it just boosts your power, speed, durability, and reflexes exponentially. There's also a couple of techniques that come with Sage of Six Paths mode, like Six Paths Kunotsukami. This ability essentially allows Ashura to create a monster chakra avatar. And this chakra avatar, though it does look eerily similar to Kurama's giant transformation mode, has nothing to do with Kurama, because obviously Ashura wasn't a Jinchuriki of Kurama. Jinchuriki weren't created for another 2,000 years. So simply with Six Paths mode, Ashura was able to essentially create Naruto's massive Kurama chakra cloak mode. And this ability allowed him to stand toe-to-toe with Indra's complete Susanoo. Ashura went so far as to equip this massive chakra avatar with True Seeker orbs that he used offensively against the Susanoo. And while this avatar was incredibly effective on offense, it was also, just like a Susanoo, incredibly effective on defense. So just with the abilities of this Sage art, Ashura essentially had the abilities of Naruto after perfecting his relationship with Kurama. There's also Naruto's Six Paths Ultra Big Ball Rasen Shuriken, which were so powerful they were were able to counter Sasuke's Indra's arrow, which, mind you, was probably one of the strongest offensive techniques we've seen in the entire run of both Naruto and Boruto. And while obviously, like I said with previous modes, this is just the boosting of an existing ninjutsu, but the scale at which it is boosted is what we're talking about. Being able to counter Sasuke's Indra's arrow, which was being powered by all 9-tailed beasts, is saying something. The scale at which Six Paths mode boosts your abilities is like no other Sage mode we've seen, and therefore it seems relatively undeniable that Sage of Six Paths mode is easily the strongest of all of the Sage modes, especially when we consider that Hashirama was constantly using it, and he literally is a god deriving power from the Pure Lands that gave chakra to the entire planet. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think my placement of all these Sage modes are correct? Are you guys understanding how one acquires a Sage mode? Are you just now realizing that Naruto, since he still technically has the Sage of Six Paths chakra mode, should be able to use that ability that Ashura used to make a giant chakra avatar, and yet doesn't for some reason? If you're thinking any of those incredibly specific thoughts, tell me in the comments below. And while you're down there, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind all of you guys, once again, I created another YouTube channel called The Weeb Commander, where we post about all things non-Naruto. This is the most important project in my life right now, and if you're here at the end of this video, it would mean a lot to me that you go and follow that page. Listen, I don't mean to expose all of Kishimoto's plot holes, I just kind of stumble into them.